Okay, so today we're going to have a quick look at some common alternatives to e4 for black, which still involve using centre pawns. We're not, again, going to go into too much detail. That's not the idea of this. It's really always aimed at new players, so it's just the first 3 or 4 moves and some of the most common lines, just so new players have some idea what's coming. So opening with d4, it's traditionally been regarded as less aggressive than e4. Doesn't tend to lead to sort of miniature games where there's checkmates and sort of 12, 15 moves. Doesn't tend to anyway. I mean, the King's Gambit, e4, e5, f4, tends to lead to quite quick tactical games, whereas the Queen's Gambit is a little different. It's a positional gambit to take the black pawn out of the centre of the board. That said, Garry Kasparov, the world champion for many, many years from the mid-1980s, probably one of the most aggressive players of all time, relied for a lot of his career on d4. So we say it's maybe got a reputation for not being that aggressive, and yet Kasparov relied on it very much. So, okay, let's start with the Queen's Gambit anyway. So start position of the Queen's Gambit is after d4, d5, and then c4. And there's various possibilities for black. What's happening is that white's offering the c pawn as a distraction to take the black queen's pawn away from the center of the board. So, well, there's lots of ways to proceed. We'll have a very brief look at all 3. The first diagram is black has the option of taking the pawn, actually accepting the gambit. The second one is to play c6, which is known as the Slav Defence. The third one, probably the most common, is to play e6. And then if black is the sort of player that likes things are a little bit more wild and unpredictable, we have the Albin Counter Gambit, e5. And I think in the Netflix series Queen's Gambit, I believe this is the variation that is used by Borgov when Beth finally beats the Russian world champion in the last episode of the series. I'm pretty sure it's an Albin Counter Gambit game. But okay, we'll have a quick look at each of those. Knight to f6 for black's second move is generally not considered any good, because after pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, white can play e4 and is just huge in the center and gaining time against the black knight. So I think probably those are the 4 options for black. So okay, I'm not going to sort of say all the moves. It's just if black accepts the gambit, this is the sort of position that will arise. I think generally black is advised not to try to hold on to the pawn. It's normally the case with gambits, is that often the best way to refute them is to take the piece and then give it back at the right moment. And this is a typical line where that's happened. We can see both sides are developed. White's probably got a little bit more central control, a bit more space, but you'd expect that to be the case because white has the first move. So perfectly reasonable line for both sides. And that's just a typical position. Black shouldn't be trying to hold on to the pawn in that instance. Another similar one again, black hasn't tried to hold on to the pawn, has accepted that white will win the pawn back. And this time black's expanding on the queen side. White has got, again, most of the control of the center. King's already castled. It's fine for both sides. That's just a typical kind of line if black doesn't try to hold on to the pawn. And if black does try to hold on to the pawn, and has done here, there's 7 black pawns to 6 white ones, but this is the sort of trouble black can get into. And, well, I'm not saying this position is lost. You know, black is a pawn up, but look at this. Total lack of development, total lack of central control. If it's white to move next, then queen to f3, it's a major threat, because we're looking at queen takes f7, we're looking at queen takes rook. It's not ideal for black, really. I think it's fair to say white has plenty of compensation here for the offered pawn. So generally, if you're going to play the Queen's Gambit accepted, that's fine. But I think generally the advice is don't try to hold on to the pawn for too long. But it's perfectly okay for black to take the pawn. Not a bad idea, but just don't try to hold on to it. Okay, so more typical would be the Slav Defence. So in the Slav Defence, black plays c6 as the second move and sets up a nice strong supported pawn in the centre. And again, I've just given a couple of typical lines. It's perfectly reasonable for both sides. One thing that can go wrong for black, although it hasn't in this variation, is getting the bishop trapped behind a sort of central triangle of pawns on c6, d5 and e6. But the Slav is very, very safe for black. I think I'm right in saying it has quite a high proportion of draws compared to other openings among masters as well. But absolutely safe, absolutely fine. This variation that I came across is a little more interesting. The pawn formation is really quite unbalanced after queen takes, after queen to d5. And yeah, it's chances for both sides. Bit of a weird one. If white played queen takes queen there, and black played e-pawn takes queen, you've got some really weird pawn formations going on. But so that's the Slav. So that's if black plays c6. The more traditional line is the black's second move will be pawn to e6. So from e7 to e6. And again, here's another typical line that you will see. White will often end up with the rook on c1 because this gambited pawn will tend to either disappear because somebody takes it or because white plays a swap on d5. So you'll often get rook onto this line. There are some variations in which white will end up with an isolated queen's pawn, which leads to some interesting play, but that's complicated for going into here. And you might often find that black will play b6 and then c5, and you can end up with pawn takes pawn, and the situation where you have black pawns on c5 and d5. And again, there's been whole textbooks written on how to play with what are called the hanging pawns in the middle of the board. But okay, so d4, d5, c4, e6, classical, typical, standard Queen's Gambit stuff. Both sides are perfectly well in the game. One thing that you could do as black, if you're going to play pawn takes pawn, is often just wait until white's tried to develop the bishop. Because if white's going to play bishop takes pawn anyway, then you may as well let them waste a move before they move the bishop again. But okay, fine. The Albin Counter Gambit is the other option. It'd be good fun if you knew it, playing blitz games with it for sure. What happens here is that black's second move is in fact e5. Far and away the best thing for white to do is to play d takes e5, and then black will move the d pawn forward one square and try to cramp the white development. So what happens? Well, white just develops naturally with knight f3. More often than not, black plays knight to c6, and white does all right with this. Master games, white wins about 50% of the time, black around 30, so that's about normal for black, but fewer draws. Slightly more white wins, fewer draws. But instead of knight c6, bishop b4 check hasn't been played much, according to the database that I looked at when I was doing this PowerPoint. And black seems to be up to 35% wins with that move, so it might be worth investigating playing bishop b4 if you're going to use the Albin. Do a bit of research on that one and see where it goes. Okay, so that's it for the Queen's Gambit. I'm just going to do a change of share and switch to the English opening. And not going to say a huge amount about the English opening. It basically involves starting with c4 as white, so the Queen's bishop pawn forward 2 squares. It's traditionally considered to be a quiet opening. It's quite easy for both sides to get safely to the middle game with just simple developing moves. What you will find is that it's quite a chameleon in the sense that it can easily transpose into Queen's pawn openings or even a King's pawn opening from time to time. But okay, so we'll have a quick look. So first, some of the transpositional lines. So if you start with c4, black might play e6, white goes d4, black plays d5, and you're back to what we just looked at in the Queen's Gambit. You can end up with something that looks a bit like this. So c4, if black plays c6, which is fine, white can play e4, d5, pawn takes, and d4, and then you suddenly ended up with the Panoff variation of the Caro-Kann. So you've transposed it into a King's pawn opening. Another option, we'll look at the Indian defences in a different PowerPoint, but c4, knight f6, d4, g6. whatever really. Knight f3 is typical, but whatever. And then bishop g7, that's this diagram, and black suddenly looking at the king's Indian defense. And these are just, say, examples of transpositions. c4, c6, d4, d5, and we've got the Slav. We're back to the Queen's Gambit. We can play c4 and then f5. Black can try the Dutch defense. So typical line might be d4 and then e6, or knight to c3 and knight f6, but the Dutch defense is playable for black as well. So c4 can tend to lead to lots and lots of different openings just via transposition. It does have its own variations as well. So one common idea is that both sides might fianchetto either one or both bishops. So fianchetto means moving a knight pawn forward one square and popping the bishop onto the gap. So there's a possible outcome there. And here's another one where white has fianchettoed the queen's side bishop. That's fine. And that's one I play with some frequency, and I'll carry on with d3, e3, bishop e2, knight d2, and you get to a quite safe middle game. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's quite a nice safe way to play. You might have to play a3 as well to stop a black knight appearing on b4. So yeah, the point about playing the English opening is both sides generally can just get on with developing pieces, a pawn or two in the middle, and wait until the middle game for the heavy action. It's weird because c5 then e5, you'd think it would be a bit like the Sicilian reversed and would be really in white's favour because of the extra move, and yet the games from the English opening just don't tend to have that unpredictable nature that the Sicilian defence has. It's quite strange. So I think that's it for this video. Just a very brief introduction for new players to the Queen's Gambit and the various variations from it, and the possibility of the English opening c4. See you next time.